What's that book you've been reading about?
It's about heroes who get to go on adventures, defeat the monsters, and save the day.
Hey everybody, Meg and Ryan here, wrapping up GameSpot Universe's Comic-Con at Home coverage with a look at HBO's Lovecraft Country. We got a new trailer and then our first clip of the show during the panel on Saturday, so we're going to break those down. We're going to talk a little bit about what we hope to see and maybe some things we noticed from the trailer. So let's get right into it. I'll throw it to you, Ryan. What did you think of the trailer?
I think the trailer is pretty cool. It's definitely communicating like the eerie tone that's sort of familiar to Lovecraft adaptations. And I like that about it. It definitely has like the creepiness to it. It has also the very strong kind of historical vibe to it. And that's always something that comes with Lovecraft, is that like there's a fantastical horror element to it, but it's always sort of meant to be grounded in reality, which is something that like, what made Lovecraft unique in his time was the sort of almost like documentary quality of his writing, right? Versus like other literature.
So the trailer opens with a look at Atticus. The trailer mostly focuses on Atticus, who is ostensibly the main character. He's played by Jonathan Majors. It's a little tricky to say from the novel that there is like a main character, since it's a little bit anthology style. But it looks like in the show, he's going to be, like our protagonist. He's narrating a little bit about his experience with sci-fi. That's one thing that you should probably know about him if you're not familiar with the book. He's a big sci-fi and fantasy nerd in the 50s. And he's also a Korean war vet, which we get a little taste of that, I would think. It's really interesting from the trailer's perspective, because it intercuts what looks like what might be like real battle scenes with also like with these, kind of like fantasy scenes as well, which is, I'm really excited to see how they handle that. We also get kind of a lot of Letty, who's Jurnee Smollett, which you would know from this year's Harley Quinn and the Birds of Prey movie. She was Black Canary. She plays Letty, who is, I guess, the other, if you're going to call the main character, she's the other protagonist. So we see what is going to be a road trip to Ardham, Massachusetts, which the joke there in the novel is that it looks like Arkham, which is, I think you could probably talk to this a little bit too, is the fact that, Lovecraft is so grounded in reality that there's actually Lovecraft Country, which is the name of the show and the book, but it's like an actual concept because he built his stories in not real like New England, but kind of real New England. Like you can kind of map it out.
It's similar to, actually, it's where I think Stephen King got his inspiration to do Castle Rock, right? Like it's they're kind of from the same region, and King was heavily influenced by Lovecraft. And it's basically a very similar thing, like imagining a place so thoroughly that it is filled with characters and places that will reoccur, to the point that like you could believe that the place exists.
Yeah, which that's something that the story does really well, I think, is the fact that we're dealing with characters in the fiction who have Lovecraft as fiction, in like Lovecraft exists as an author in the story, right? So like they know what Lovecraft Country is the same way that we know what Lovecraft Country is, which is why the Arkham weirdness works. I don't know if that's, obviously it's hard to tell from the trailer if that's going to be, like a one-to-one translation from the novel or not, but I thought that was really cute when they did that. So that's kind of one of the stories that we can definitely tell in the trailer, is the family road trip with Atticus and his uncle George and Letty going to find Atticus's father, Montrose, which I won't give too much away. It's kind of hard to tell in the trailer if they're gonna find him, if he shows up, if like what's going on there. But we also see some Hippolyta, who is George's wife. She's one of the plots in the novel, so you can see there's a clip of a woman sitting on the floor with like a observatory someone who's better at astronomy or astrology, which I don't know the difference between the two, which proves how qualified I am to talk about this.
Well, I mean, that's fine. That's fine because it's that's sort of what Lovecraft is anyway. Is a mix of the two.
Yeah. So we get kind of a scene. It looked like a scene of her playing with that, which is one of the other subplots of the novel. And then there's also a clip of what looks like Ruby, who is Letty's sister, drinking a serum or a magic potion, which in the novel, that is another plot that I'm very curious to see how they translate. But probably one of the most interesting things that, we want to take a thorough look at in this trailer is the fact that the antagonist seems to be gender swapped, maybe. In the novel, the Braithwaites are a family that is, I don't know how you would really describe them other than like eldritch mages who are connected. It's that very Lovecraft trope.
Yeah, you can't have a Lovecraft story without some kind of cult involved on some level. Or if not Lovecraft, at least some sort of Lovecraft themed story, or like in the role playing game, you're gonna have a cultist somewhere.
Exactly. So there's in the novel there's the Braithwaite family, which is a cult legacy type situation that intersects with Atticus and his journey. But it's Caleb in the novel, and it seems like they've flipped it to Christina, who's played by Abby Lee. She was also on the panel to kind of provide some context, but she called herself in the panel, she called herself the antagonist. But then there's also a blonde guy in the trailer who we see several times, and I couldn't find anything about him on IMDb. I looked, I don't know who that actor is. I don't know. There's no Caleb listed on IMDb, so I don't know what they're gonna do there. I think
sounds like they're like changing things up a little bit, maybe.
Right. Yeah. Or I mean, maybe it's gonna go with like a very Lovecraftian alternate dimension type thing, and there's gonna be a version of Caleb that's female and a version of Caleb that's male, and I don't know.
I kind of like that theory right there.
Right. Yeah. It would be really interesting. So I don't know what's going on there, but I think that that's something that we should probably be paying attention to in moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who's not familiar with the book at all, the one thing that does kind of stand out from looking at the clip that they showed too is that what they're showing in the trailer and the clips is relatively mundane, not super fantastical. I know there's like a monster in there, but
sure,
monster's a monster, but like Lovecraft stories go into insanity and other dimensions and crazy cosmic stuff too.
Right. Yeah, I think we had a whole You Should Be Watching episode that I did with the podcast crew that we talked a lot about cosmic horror and kind of what's tricky about adapting it. And I think that was something that we touched upon there, was the fact that it's hard to talk about things such a big part of Lovecraft stories is the fact that you can't look directly at the monster and you can't talk about it without losing your mind, and how hard that is.
It can't be described.
Right, yeah. Which, I mean, we'll talk about that in a second as, when we're talking about what we are hoping to see from the show. But I think that's a big part. And that's kind of a big part of the novel, too, is that it threads that needle in a kind of an interesting way that I haven't seen in some, cosmic horror or Lovecraftian style stories, because it does such a good job of relating that type of horror to actual literal social and political horror that has is actually based in reality, which is something that the panel talked about too, is the fact that it's a horror story and it's fantasy and it's sci-fi, but it's also a really hard look at 1955 Jim Crow America, and that's part of the scare, is the fact that a Cthulhu style demon monster is just as terrifying as a sheriff with a shotgun in a sundown town, which is really, I think that's a scary thing.
And that's if anything, that's a pretty explicit beat in that trailer.
Yeah, for
too.
sure. Which I think, we've come to expect that sort of thing from like Jordan Peele as a storyteller, which I think is one of his, strong suits, which I really hope we have more of that, because I think that that's so cool.
I 100% agree.
This is definitely a door. Spread out. See if you can find a way to open it.
So let's talk a little bit about the clip too, because we got an actual, not cut up, full on episode clip at the end of the trailer, which it was very Indiana Jones, right?
Oh yeah. And very much in that vein too of what the experience of playing the tabletop game is, which reaches into Lovecraft as well.
Sure.
The investigators that are trying to discover something.
Yeah.
The sort of there's always somebody that went one step further than like the main characters, and there's always this kind of thing of like, in this case they're finding a secret passage, right? And that just, and it's a group, in this case the story's of a family, but sometimes it's just more or less strangers that have been united. But it's super in that vein.
Yeah, I think it's very cool because it's got, like I said, Indiana Jones, but it's also got a little bit of like a Goonies style. Like, it's fun. It's not necessarily, the clip itself is not necessarily scary, but it's got kind of like a looming threat of like, oh God, there's 3 passages underground, and like, something bad is going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yes.
So right now it's fun and kind of cute and adventure story-y, but it probably won't be for very long. The only thing I will say is that I don't know if it was a finished clip or not, but I did think that the VFX, like especially with like the beam of light that opened the passage, didn't look totally done to me. So I hope that it's, either a little bit more polished or a little less obviously CG when the episode airs, but that's a really petty small complaint. So.
I hear you though. I hear you. Looking at the trailer, like with the monster, there's a thing that looks like from the mythos, it would be a star spawn of Cthulhu. This very large sort of cephalopodic creature with wings. And that looked pretty good to me.
Yeah,
in the brief moment we saw it in the trailer.
For sure. Yeah, that did not ping me as like unfinished at all. Whereas like the light being, the
light, yeah.
It just kind of looked like a laser pointer.
Yeah.
Like, that's not really, But so that's kind of all we got as far as content is concerned, and like the show is premiering August 16th, so it's not that long.
We're almost
away.
there.
Yeah, we're almost there. So let's talk a little bit about what we want to see, what we hope to see. I'm really interested to hear from what you're expecting, because I know you haven't read the novel, so you don't have any sort of like preconceived notions of like what's coming. So what do you hope to see from the show?
Well, it's interesting because I didn't, full disclosure, know that there was a novel.
Sure.
Until the panel. And I just thought, because it's so common for Lovecraft to be adapted in some way, that it was like, okay, they're using the Lovecraft name, but it'll be something of a spin-off of his writing.
Sure.
I didn't realize there was a full novel behind it, which actually gives me some confidence.
Yeah.
And then I also didn't know until talking to you that it was sort of an anthology. And I'm actually kind of hoping, just from that limited knowledge I have, that there's something that it's maybe anthologized, because that's something that has worked well, I think, for the Twilight Zone, to have a little bit of a disconnection from episode to episode without having to be like this involved continuous plot line.
Sure.
That allows each episode to kind of, to stand on its own, to have its own, like its own message, its own, it maybe in the case of a horror thing, like its own scares. And that's also very fitting to Lovecraft, because while Lovecraft did have, a handful of longer novels and novellas, I think a lot of people who read Lovecraft are more familiar with Lovecraft as an anthology writer, somebody who you pick up a thick book of short stories and you just read one story at a time, and they're about different characters in different places. So I can tell that they're not going with totally different characters, but they're from episode to episode. But I do kind of like the idea of like a little bit being a little bit monster of the weeky, because that's also very Lovecraft. Like the mythos world of Lovecraft is full of tons of monsters and scary things, and there isn't just one monster or one cult or whatever that you are constantly up against. It's something new, more scary, different every time.
Yeah, I think that's the one thing that I'm the most curious, I think, about how they're going to adapt the novel, because it's only, as far as we know, it's an 8-episode series, and we don't have any indication about whether or not it's going to be, you know, like there's going to be a season 2, or if it's going to be a continuing thing, or what have you. As you know, like with the information that we have, it's 8 episodes, and so I think there are, if I remember correctly, there's 4, maybe 5, like, I guess you would, like, anthology, I keep using air quotes when I say that, because it's not like a proper anthology, but it is like episodic in a way, where it's, you know, kind of disconnected plots that have characters that overlap with themes that overlap, obviously. And I don't know how they're going to do that across 8 episodes if they don't kind of, you know, keep it, you know, maybe they're 1 or 2 episode arcs for each individual storyline, or maybe they're weaving them all together. I'm really excited and really curious to see how that works and how that translates to TV. And I think, yeah, like you said, Jordan Peele has really proven himself with the anthology style storytelling with Twilight Zone. So if anything, I think he can really improve on the format that was given to us in the novel. And so I'm really excited to see that. I'm also really just excited to see how they're going to do a lot of the surreal monster horror stuff, because, you know, that's kind of the make or break for me, I guess, with a lot of cosmic horror, is how they're gonna translate those big concepts into visual. You know, like you can't dodge and duck around it with fancy prose in you know, TV shows. You have to show the monster, you have to deal with that, you know, content very visually. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see. I
hear you on that. I think that is, if anything, the most sort of legit concern, because like, you know, Lovecraft's writing has a certain campiness and horror that kind of intertwine with each other very well. But a lot of the time that does not translate that well to screen. Like, there aren't many very, you know, excellent adaptations of actual Lovecraft stories that we can point to and say, oh, that was really good. Like, a lot of the good Lovecraftian like movies weren't actually based on Lovecraft. Like, you know,
it's
like
just the kind
Thing,
of vibes.
Or a couple other John Carpenter movies where, you know, they're not based on Lovecraft explicitly. Although, what was the recent one? The Richard Stanley film, Color Out of Space. That was pretty good.
Yeah, I still haven't seen it yet, but I really want to.
It faces the thing that you're talking about sort of head on, which is like, what do you do when you have a horrible thing that isn't like really something that you can show?
Right, it's not like a physical thing you can show. Which, I mean, I think I'm really, I feel like if anyone's gonna thread that needle, it's gonna be this show. In, like, as far as we've seen so far, it's doing a really excellent job. I think even just with that little moment in the trailer we get with the cream of wheat poster that with the eyes moving, like, ooh, that was so weird and like uncomfortable and perfect. I hope for more moments like that coming up.
And that also is a good thing to bring up, because it's like, you know, the cream of wheat sort of icon, the character of it, you know, that's been in the news recently. You know, the depiction of African American people in like sort of capitalist form. And I think that is like also a perfect example of where, you know, what we see with Peele's things related to Peele in general is the ability to thread that needle too. To point at things without dwelling on it.
Yeah,
like that
definitely.
it can just be there.
It can be there and like make a comment without being like a big spectacle.
Yeah. And on top of that, like, you know, from the panel, it was super clear that for a lot of the cast members, that historical context and its relationship to the present day is very important to them, and I assume super important to the creators of the show, which is, I imagine, why Peele is involved as well.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And that's interesting because they do give a historical context. They talked about the Green Book and how the characters are part of working on that project.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of interesting that there's this potential here for this kind of like pop culture off-brand Lovecraft horror show to potentially be a more interesting or accurate examination of the history of the Green Book than the movie Green Book.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's funny because it's a fictionalized version, at least in the novel, but the way that they intertwine that plot with the characters in the story, it's, you know, George and Hippolyta specifically are working on the safe travel guide, but it's done in such a way that it folds in the characters' love of like fantasy and pop culture and sci-fi. So like they have this map that they've made that represents like different unsafe towns with like dragons wrapped around. It's like a big, you know, like it's a big fantasy map, but it's,
that's awesome.
You know, it's really cool the way that it's talked about in the story. So I really hope we get to see that in, you know, in the flesh in the show, because I think that that's such a cool way to like fictionalize it without necessarily like fictionalizing it to the point that like a movie like Green Book did, which is a weird thing to say because this is a totally different thing.
It rings true. It rings true.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I can't wait for the show. I'm so excited to see it.
Yeah,
like
me
I
too.
said, it premieres on HBO August 16th. It is 8 episodes long. We hope that it's gonna be all of this and more.
This is our family story.
So that's what our sort of first impressions are from the Comic-Con at Home panel for Lovecraft Country. Let us know down in the comments what you thought of it if you had a chance to take a look.